Hi, everyone. Thanks, members, for joining us and our other followers. We're real excited about this. This is just the follow-up to our webinar, which was last week on the disruptive power of quantum computing. And we want to welcome our attendees to this fun and absorbing fireside chat on the power of quantum computing, where our panelists will answer attendee questions. My name is Lauren, and I'm the founder and publisher of Disruptive Technologists. And this is just our 1-hour casual question and answer, which will be recorded and posted on the Disruptive Technologists YouTube channel and through our Meetup site and through our website and all of our other sites. So today we're continuing to give away another 3 free 2-day passes to Upflex. Thank you for everyone who's answered and put things on there. I see Sep just stepped in. He's actually going to take over now. Hi, Sep.
Hello.
Sep is our MC. I was just stepping in for him because I'm trying to keep these things on time. But Sep, introduce yourself. He's our MC. Go for it.
Hello, I'm Sep DeMaglio. I am an accessibility consultant at Microsoft. I MC these things.
Do you want to go for it?
Yeah, I'll take over. Are we ready?
Okay, it's yours.
So, Disruptive Technologists welcomes attendees to our fun and absorbing fireside chat on the power of quantum computing, where panelists answer attendees' questions. Like I just said, my name's Sep. I'm a Disruptive Technologists MC, and I do accessibility for Microsoft. This is our 1-hour casual question and answer, which will be recorded and posted on our Disruptive Technologists YouTube channel. Today, we're going to continue giving away another 3 free 2-day passes to Upflex, the fabulous global office spaces, their on-demand workspaces that set your teams free. We're also going to be giving away 3 futuristic books by Rebecca Costa, including On the Verge. To enter that lottery, just email your name, title, and company and email address to info@disruptivetechnologists.com or to the organizer of the Disruptive Technologists and NYC meetup. We'll put that information in the chat as well. We'd like to thank our friends and supporters who've been with Disruptive Tech for the last several years. Although we aren't together in person quite yet, we want to show them our thanks. So thanks to Microsoft Reactor, the neighborhood campuses, where developer and startup communities meet, learn, and connect. Thanks to Ramona Wright for supporting our podcast program. Thanks to Esther Dyson for supporting our newsletter program. Thanks to Scott Moss for helping us upgrade our website. Thanks to Zeotag, the interactive video services. And thanks to the Disruptive Technologists Chairman, David Soren. We're looking forward to being able to connect again very shortly, hopefully. And now I'm going to hand off things to our moderator, Bruce Epstein, an AU content expert for ABIS. I hope I said that right.
Thanks, Sep. Yeah, that's just perfect. So welcome, everyone. And so I'd like to start by introducing our awesome panelists for today's fireside chat. So first we have Mark Mattingley-Scott, who is a quantum computing architect, has been for a very long time. Now General Manager EMEA for Quantum Brilliance, formerly of IBM, and a board member here with Disruptive Technologists. Second, we have Danica Hannon. Hi, Danica, the leader of the Minnesota Quantum Computing Meetup. In the Women on Quantum Advisory Board, volunteered for a quantum computing startup called Bolts.ai, relationship manager with Cambridge Quantum Computing, and deputy head and IQSD chair for the Quantum Strategy Institute. Amazing number of times quantum appeared in that sentence. And finally, we have Frank Lavigne, who is a published author, podcaster, conference speaker, discovered quantum computing at a Microsoft conference in 2019. Last year, 2020, he launched an Impact Quantum podcast, impactquantum.com, to share his enthusiasm for quantum technologies with fellow data scientists. This year, he has joined Coverse, a platform that adds enhanced security solutions for highly sensitive big data implementations. So the point of this fireside is to handle the questions that were asked during last week's panel webinar. Those of you who are attending this in real time, you can use the chat function to add additional questions, and we will get to them as time allows during the session. And so I'm going to start off with a fairly basic, but I suspect misleadingly simple question, deceptively simple, sorry. When we use the words quantum computing, just what is it that we're talking about? Mark, let's start with you. You've been around for a while. What does that mean?
I've been around for a while. Yeah.
We're not talking HR.
What that means, Bruce, is that I'm old. Oh, you meant what does quantum computing mean? Well, what it means is that we are tapping the fundamental principles of how we understand the universe to compute things, to accelerate the way we solve problems. And if you imagine that quantum mechanics is a branch of physics that really was discovered more or less by a handful of physicists whose names you would all recognize. Einstein, Heisenberg, those sort of people. This was discovered and uncovered and unearthed, if you will, at the beginning of the 20th century, up into the 20s. And it's a theory which has proven to be probably the most robust theory in physics ever. It's insanely good at predicting how the nature behaves. But it explains by basically telling us that there's a part of reality or aspects to reality that we can't directly perceive. And it's exactly those aspects that we use in quantum computing to perform computations. I always like to say that if you want to understand and you ask 10 physicists, then you get 11 different answers. That's a poor physicist joke, but there's a grain of truth to it. So we still don't really understand what's behind quantum physics, quantum mechanics. What we do know is we can use it. We can use it to predict how the universe and how the world exists, and we can certainly use it to perform very fast computations. But why it works, we don't know. So, Bruce, I hope that answer was sufficiently enlightening and sufficiently confusing at the same time. As we're talking about quantum computing, then we always have to be in a superposition of states. So I want an answer that illuminates and confuses at the same time. I hope that worked for you.
Danica, would you like to jump off on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mark, you did just a beautiful job explaining the math and the physics and the science behind that. I'm not going to try and hold a candle to that. But and what I will say is when we talk about quantum computing from the business side, I feel like people get excited because there's so much untapped potential. So when you start to talk to people about quantum computing, and I'm in a business development role, so I have the privilege of talking to people who are interested in this every week. And a very common theme is that people are saying, I'm starting to hear buzz about this, and I'm getting excited because I think that this means that I can start tackling problems that I couldn't solve before. So Mark absolutely did a fantastic job explaining why this is so incredible on the physics and the math and the science side. On the business side, my sense is that there's such a buzz around this because people are feeling a sense of excitement and hope of like, okay, cool, now we can start going after these challenging problems that we've been wanting to pursue for years. But because we didn't have the computational power, we couldn't. So a nice example I heard about this the other day was about Tide Pods. And I heard a story that with Tide Pods, the makers of them had the idea for making these pods for many years, but they didn't have a computer that was powerful enough to start simulating the materials that could go into it because they needed something that could dissolve at both warm and very cold temperatures that could stay in the packet for a certain amount of time, break apart at the right time. And so when they were finally able to take that idea and make it real, it just exploded. So from the business standpoint, when we talk about quantum computing and what are we really getting at, I think we're tapping into that excitement of just like, oh yes, there are all these hard problems that now we can finally do something about.
Great. And just a reminder for anybody listening in, Tide Pods are not a snack food. Frank, care to chime in on what it's all about?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to say, like, what a great innovation and example of kind of some of the room we have to go with material science, yet we have to remind people not to eat them. I think that says a lot about the current state of our world. Yeah, so I think that both of those are both of those viewpoints are absolutely correct. There's kind of the raw physics kind of at the core of it, the raw engineering. There's also kind of the business and, you know, what sorts of opportunities and does this open up? But I like to focus on kind of, you know, as someone who's spent my career doing software development and implementation of data and AI, I think that there's a huge opportunity here for people to grow their skill set and grow their career into this space.
Okay,
I
great.
think there's a massive opportunity there.
Frank, could you talk about that a bit more? Bruce, I hope I'm not taking away your question, but that's a big area. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's going to be, you know, the way that computer scientists, at least I have a degree in computer science, there's any number of people who are in the process of learning the code, right? Whether they do it through boot camps, traditional university, or just kind of self-taught. There's a whole, because of the nature, like the underlying nature of the way quantum computing works is different than traditional computing. There's all sorts of new logic gates that are open, you know, new sorts of logic gates that have been created. So now we have this, you know, I mean, even stuff that I haven't thought about since university, you know, AND gates, NOT gates, that sort of thing. And that was way long ago. Just the whole, what that sort of changes and what that sort of involves at that level, you know, I wouldn't say I have to unlearn a lot of things that I just take for granted as a software engineer, because it's just a different environment. And, you know, I think that there's going to be a learning curve. I don't know how steep that's going to be. You know, maybe folks are just getting into it. Maybe they'll have an advantage because they don't have anything to unlearn, right? The kind of, I really wonder. And, you know, one of the questions that came up in the chat last week was, you know, how do you recommend that someone who is a traditional or conventional computing engineer, how do they get into the space? And I would say there's really no well-worn path yet. There's certainly a lot of people that are, you know, blazing new trails. On my podcast, I interviewed Lynn Langett, which I was looking at the book club that she organized. I saw a familiar face. I saw Danica's face in there. So, I mean, there's just people that are kind of dipping their toe in the water and kind of leaving a trail for others. So I would say, in terms of opportunity, I think that the best time to plant a tree is, you know, if you want shade in 20 years, the best time to start would have been 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. So just start getting involved with it. You know, there is no well-worn path. It's not like there's hundreds of YouTube videos that tell you how to learn the code or how to land an interview at big tech companies, but there's no well-worn path yet. So you can look at that in one of two ways, right? Kind of this, I'll throw the quantum wave there analogy there. You can look at that as, wow, that's really, you know, depressing. There's no guide path to follow. Or you can look at it at the point of view, well, you know, that's fresh snow I can put my footprints in. And, you know, it's up to you to collapse the probability wave. So I don't know how many people got that joke, but, you know, it was a quantum joke.
Yes. And I was going to ask if among the new gates, there's a Heisenberg gate that you don't really know what state it's in, and the Schrodinger gate that if you try to find out, it'll destroy it. Okay, Mark, did you want to say something?
Yeah. That was a very, very good point about the fact that it's getting your head around how to program quantum computers, if you've learned how to program classical computers, is a non-trivial exercise. And if you look back at the history of quantum computation, one of the kind of fundamental principles was discovered in 1961, when a physicist called Rolf Landauer proved that, quite an esoteric result, but he proved that a computational step, anything we do to compute, increases what's called the entropy, the uncertainty in the universe, by a really, 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 really tiny amount. That led to further research on this, and in the 1970s, another physicist called Charlie Bennett proved that you could take any function that you can compute on a computer, and you can rewrite it so it's reversible. Also sounds very esoteric, but what that means is, if you've got a function you want to compute, you can rewrite it so it's reversible. That means, okay, aufgepasst, pay attention. You go to steps, and then you can go back in the reverse direction, back to where you come from. And the state of the universe is the same, with the exception of you've now got a result. And that laid the foundation, the theoretical foundations, the ideas that there might be something we could do with quantum computation. And it was in the 1980s that the idea to actually make qubits came up. So if you want to think about how to program a quantum computer, essentially all quantum computing programs are things that you can do and then reverse the direction of. That's kind of counterintuitive. That's not how we do things in the real world. We walk from A to B. And the thing you just said about, well, footprints in the snow, very good example. You can walk across the snow-covered field to the other side. The quantum computing equivalent is you walk across the snow-covered field to the other side, and then you walk exactly backwards in your footsteps. When you go back to where you came from, everything's the same, except you now know the solution to your problem. So it is very counterintuitive in some ways. What we found when I was working at IBM was that
I lost his audio. Did anyone else?
Mark, we just lost your audio for some reason.
That's my audio. How's it now?
Good.
Yeah. One of the things we found educating people was that the younger generation, so people who were teenagers, pre-university, they seem to grasp how to program a quantum computer much more quickly than especially Bruce, old guys like me. Mm-hmm. But it does appear to be a generational thing. And I saw this back in the 1990s with the internet, with the World Wide Web. We had the same thing. The new younger generation understood hypertext in a very intuitive way that nobody else did. The younger generation now grasp the principles of Hadamard gates and C0 gates and reversibility much better, much more quickly than anybody else. So we are caught in the middle of a revolution, but the ability to use and leverage that's something for the coming generations, very much.
Go ahead, Danica.
If I could jump in, I'd love to build on what Frank was talking about with the opportunities and how there isn't a set path to move into this area yet. And if you're someone who is interested in working in this industry, there's a couple things that I'd really encourage you to do. And the first one is to start spending time around people who are already where you want to be. So for me, in 2018, I got to start working with the Minnesota Quantum Computing Meetup members and spending time with other people who are really invested in this, who had a much deeper understanding of the space than I did. And I had a very pivotal conversation at one of those meetups where I was talking to a gentleman who has since become my mentor. And I said, look, don't have any experience with coding. I think I'm going to quit my job and go become a software engineer because I really want to get into quantum computing. I know that I need coding skills, and I think that becoming a software engineer and then working my way into it is the way to do it. He said, that's a route, but have you thought about going through a data science boot camp, like, working and doing this nights and weekends? And it really felt like someone handed me keys to a door that I didn't even know existed, because I didn't know that you could take a data science boot camp. I didn't know that data science was a field. There was so much that I didn't even know that I didn't know. So many unknowns there. And what's really neat about that is that when you spend time with people who are where you want to go, they can give you that coaching to speed up your path. Another example of that is I'm mentoring a young woman right now through a formal mentorship program, Woman in Quantum. So if anybody else is interested in getting mentorship, that's a great place to start. But we're mentoring this young woman where when we first started talking a few months ago, she was telling me about how she was coming up on completing her master's program and how she wanted to go get a PhD. And she said, and in 2 to 4 years, when I complete my PhD, then I want to get a job in industry. But she emphasized how getting a job in industry was her end goal, how it was really important to her. We started talking and we brought up the idea of, well, instead of waiting to complete your PhD and then go in industry, what do you think of trying to tackle that now? So over the past 2 months, we've been working on rewriting her resume so that it's friendly for a business audience, going over the fundamentals of a cover letter and how do you show your value to a company, and best practices for introducing yourself in a business versus an academic setting. And the really neat thing is that that's paid off for her. She has a job offer from a company that she's very excited about, and she's going through the interview process with another company that's also in the quantum computing space. So to Frank's point about how there's all this unbroken stone, all this opportunity, and there's no real clear paths yet, he's absolutely right. And if you're looking to get into this space, I would strongly encourage you to spend time with people who are already where you want to be, because there's a real chance that they can help speed you up and point out shortcuts that you don't know are there.
Great, and wonderful advice for individuals. I'd also like to pick your brains now. Similar advice for people who are already in business. We keep hearing that this is coming soon, and I'll actually come back to that question later. But what should people in business today be doing to prepare themselves for what seems like an inevitable disruption? What can they do? What should they do? Frank, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would say start. I mean, this is how when I first heard about this and saw that it was going to impact kind of what data scientists like me were going to be doing, the first thing I did, was, that night at the hotel, I installed the Q-Sharp development kit, and I was all excited. I'm like, I'm gonna code up some quantum systems. And then when I started looking at it, I was like, wait, what? There was definitely a wall I hit. So, so I really started, watching a lot of the, the Brian Greene type specials on Michio Kaku, his books and the documentaries he's done on quantum physics, and kind of, yeah, that is probably not what the rank and file quantum developer will have to know, but I think there's a lot I need to learn, and there's certainly some things I need to unlearn when it comes to software engineering. And in that sense, the younger generation does have a advantage in that sense. They're not as invested in their ideas, but I also think that if you are a person of the older persuasion, or chronologically gifted, as I like to say, then you have the option of kind of adopting a growth mindset, right? It's not game over. You can kind of realize that you have to unlearn some of the things that you have learned and kind of start from zero from that point of view. So, and it's a process, at least for me. I mean, again, it's, my journey is, I like to think I'm a trailblazer. I like to think I'm a smart guy. But there's definitely things that I can kind of share that I've learned. One is that, this is hard stuff. I mean, this is not trivial stuff to get your head around. Even Einstein, had difficulty getting his head around this. And, when it comes to uncertainty and all that, he famously coined two phrases, God does not play dice, And the other one is spooky action at a distance, which I forget the original German, but it sounds really cool in German. But this is not trivial stuff. This isn't like, hey, I'm a web developer. I'm going to pick up a new, I'm going to pick up a new JavaScript framework, and I'll be functional within a couple of weeks. It's not that way. Or I'm already an R developer, so I'll learn Python. Or whatever analogy you want to use. This is not that way. And for me, it felt like it was both humbling and exciting that here we are. This is completely unlike anything I've ever done before, and it's hard, and it's kind of embrace the fact that it's difficult, because otherwise that's going to be a hard mountain to climb. And
well, you know what, let's on that note, let's talk about the real thing. Mark, let's talk about IBM. Is it now going to be passe? What about the gold chandeliers? Why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Golden chandeliers. Yeah, so basically they are refrigerators, or let's say refrigerators combined with some microwave electronics. In a lot, not all, but a lot of the quantum computing technology, you need to operate at a very, very low temperature. And very, very low is thousandths of a degree above absolute zero. The chandelier is basically a way to pipe microwave signals into the qubits, into the chip with the qubits in it, and read the microwaves out. That chandelier is encased in a special metal enclosure inside the high vacuum, so there's no molecules buzzing around. Essentially, what you have in there is a state very close to absolutely nothing. And in that state of absolutely nothing, you can make these qubits, and they maintain their quantum spookiness at a distance. They maintain their quantum state, we call it coherence, for a relatively long time, so that we can use them to do computations. Relatively long, we're talking about a few microseconds, maybe tens, maybe 100 microseconds. That's still enough to do a computation. Almost all the technologies we use to make qubits have either this aspect of being operating at a very, very low temperature, or they're using photons, or they're using some other esoteric state of matter. There's very little which can actually be used at room temperature. Room temperature, we basically have some qubits where you're working with photons and qubits based on diamonds. That's, from my point of view, a game changer, a game changer on top of the already game-changing nature of quantum computing. Room temperature quantum computing basically opens the technology up to become truly ubiquitous, to be able to use it everywhere. And I think now we're at the stage where quantum computing is where silicon development was, and perhaps in the mid-60s. We could make transistors. We could put transistors, maybe a handful of transistors onto one piece of silicon. In 1968, Gordon Moore announced that he'd been able to put 1,000 transistors on the chip. That was the start of the silicon boom. And I think we're now with quantum computing at the same point. We're going to see a huge acceleration in the power of quantum computers in the next few years, and a massive increase in the class and character of problems that they can be used to solve. The challenge still remains, and Bruce alluded to this, and Frank as well. It is a challenge to be able to program them. It's not trivial. And in order to do that, you need to understand the principles of programming, and you need to understand the kinds of problems that you're trying to solve. So what we're going to see is very, very specific problems where a quantum computer will provide a very specific speed up. That's going to remain the case for the next few years. Maybe one day in the future, in a decade or so, we'll see a universal quantum computer which can be used to solve all problems. But for now, we're looking at a surgeon's knife, which can be used to cut very, very specific way, but still in such a way that the economic benefit, the business benefit, will be unimaginably large. Just imagine being able to do things, especially in material science or optimization, machine learning, which are totally infeasible today. Where that exactly happens and what the actual impact is very, very difficult to say, but it's going to be very big.
So what are some of those real world problems? What are some of those specific real world problems that IBM and Microsoft, and now both of you, Frank and Mark, are going into your new companies? What are you trying to solve now?
Well, I would say, given that I work for a company that was bought by SAIC, which is a huge government contractor. Last week, I was at the AUSA conference. So it was the first time I've been at a conference for a year and a half. And it was basically the Association of the United States Army. And there was the IBM booth, and it was quantum was their big kind of play. And it's all about, Mark can probably dive deep into the math behind this, but ultimately conventional methods of encryption, everything from, missile codes to, when you buy something on Amazon, relies on the fact that it's hard for conventional computers to factor prime numbers or take a very large number and find out the prime numbers that made that big number. I'm oversimplifying, but it turns out quantum computing can do that thanks to Shor's algorithm, which is 94, 95-ish, can do that in moments as opposed to decades or centuries. That is one that is definitely top of mind from a lot of people.
So the real world problem is just dealing in huge numbers now.
Well, in that sense, it's really more about reverse engineering conventional or breaking conventional encryption. And that is something that that's making a lot of people nervous, from, bank presidents to heads of state. That certainly is one type of mathematical problem that quantum computing has the enormous potential to solve very quickly. And that's the one that, just in the last week, you went from kind of, Frank's that data guy that's into quantum to, hey, look, I found this huge research project. Why don't you take a look at this? And kind of in that space. There's all sorts of problems that are just computationally expensive. You're not going to, you're probably not going to have the iPhone Q or whatever in some distant time frame. That might come about, like Mark said, but right now, quantum computing is relegated to very specific, very interesting parts of computing problems, material science, mathematical problems. If you're a data scientist, quantum annealing, or you're basically trying to find the global minimum of a particular loss function, and that makes no sense to you, just basically you're trying to figure out to optimize your neural network or your machine learning training.
I would just on one point, Frank.
What'd you say?
Which is, I disagree with you on one point.
Mm-hmm.
I think we are going to see the quantum chip inside an iPhone in the not too distant future, because you mentioned encryption, but there are a couple of other things where we know that quantum computing will provide a speed up. One of them you also mentioned, which is around material science, especially things like computational chemistry and pharmaceuticals. But another area is around machine learning. And we know that there are particular problems in machine learning where quantum computers can provide a significant benefit. Among other things, the recognition in machine learning is called labeling. Labeling of time series data. Typical time series data is earpads in. They are sampling the sound waves about, 20,000, 40,000 times a second. That's a series of numbers. It's a time series. Analyzing such a time series is a lot of computation powerful. Once the numbers you're analyzing becomes large, this can achieve significant performance improvements in terms of how much data can they look at, how much data can they include in their pattern matching, looking for things. And what does that mean in reality? That means, for example, speech recognition in my iPhone. In I don't know, 10 years, there may well be some chip in there, improving the performance of my speech recognition, doing a much better job. I mean, speech recognition today is already pretty impressive, but imagine the fish built into basically everything. That might well become reality. The other one you mentioned was encryption, of course, Shor's algorithm. I don't know if you know it, but there are also so-called variational versions of Shor's algorithm, which are even faster. So that's why governments are worried about quantum computing, and the banking industry, finance industry as well. So it's going to be very disruptive. I'm sure when you were at the conference, you noticed that IBM and others were talking about the new key exchange protocols, which have been developed by the American National Institutes of Science and Technology. So moves are afoot to counter that, to compensate for that, to allow for quantum computing, potential quantum computing based attacks on cryptography, to make cryptography immune to quantum computing. So don't worry too much yet, but it is additional effort, and it does require conscious effort, conscious impetus, and a conscious decision to do it. So this is a technology which is going to be massively disruptive, and we cannot ignore it.
So I'd like to build on that point, Lauren, of what are the use cases that we're looking at right now. And Mark and Frank, you both brought up excellent examples. With Cambridge Quantum, we're largely focused on doing proofs of concept and research projects. And one of the really exciting projects that we're working on right now is getting a better understanding of how patients will respond to cancer treatment. And it's personal to me. I've had my grandma ended up passing away from cancer. And as I remember that when I was a kid, like, she would be battling cancer, and my parents were pretty upfront about, we're not sure how this is going to turn out. You know, I got very fortunate. She ended up living through my 20s, which was huge. But I remember my dad having very candid conversations with my sister and I, and saying, like, I don't have many memories of my grandpa because of when he passed away. And I remember talking with my grandpa about it, and my grandpa saying, I don't have any memories of my grandpa because I was so young. So I'm really excited about the work that we're doing with better understanding how patients are going to respond to therapies and how quantum computing can help us unlock that problem, because that has such a real world impact. And I look at my niece and I look at how she got to spend time with her great grandpa, and we got to have 4 generations in one room, and she got to be old enough to where I think when she gets older, even, she'll still have those memories. So she was around him when she was 4 or 5 versus 1 or 2. And, you know, all these little things are going to have really big impacts. So for the real world use cases that we're working on right now, biomarkers and understanding how people are going to respond to treatment is a huge one. Another one that I am personally very interested in is the work that we're doing around Monte Carlo simulations. So the Monte Carlo simulations, you're trying to understand risk. And we recently released new research where we did a quantum Monte Carlo integration. What was unique about that was that we can now analyze more data with the quantum Monte Carlo integration than we can with traditional Monte Carlo simulations that run on classical computers. And if you think about where we can apply that, we can take that and we can start doing research with insurance. And with insurance, we know that the world is continuing to get riskier. You know, with climate change, with weather patterns changing, there's more unpredictability that's getting introduced. So if you just isolate to weather patterns, then that's going to impact how are people moving, what's the property loss. So it's going to help us understand things in a better way than we could before. And I like to think optimistically that it's going to help us better safeguard people and make better decisions around how do you get ahead of this wildfire, or how do you better insure people so that if they're in the face of disaster, you can get them back on their feet more quickly. So a couple of use cases that we're working on right now at Cambridge Quantum are the ones with biomarkers and understanding how people are going to respond to cancer treatment, and the quantum Monte Carlo integration and getting a much better understanding of risks. And both of those have very real world impacts.
I'd like to follow up on that. What have you been finding in terms of characteristics that generally make a problem amenable to being solved with a quantum approach? What do we know about that, and what advice do you have?
Mark, would you like to take a stab at that first? I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. I guess the first and most obvious area where we know that quantum computers actually provide a real benefit goes back to the birth of the idea of quantum computing, which was in the early 80s, when physicist Richard Feynman and others proved that you could use a quantum mechanical system to simulate another quantum mechanical system. Sounds very abstract, but if one of those quantum mechanical systems is a bunch of qubits, and the other one is the binding energy of a water molecule, that becomes interesting. Or if it's the binding energy and 3D topology of a paracetamol or aspirin, then it suddenly becomes very, very interesting, because you can use qubits to simulate something that has an effect in the real world. That particular class of qubits, that particular class of problems, simulating things in the real world, chemistry, pharmaceuticals, material science. And that was a kind of almost like a no-brainer that was there from the very, very start. You mentioned, Frank, you mentioned Shor's algorithm. So Peter Shaw was not, I think it was 1994. He came up with the genius idea of considering factoring a number, finding the prime factors of a number, as being equivalent in some way to, for example, playing a chord on a piano and trying to decide what are the individual notes in the chord. So if you consider the number you want to factor as the chord, what notes are being played? And you can, in the real world, you can find that out by doing what's called a Fourier transform. In the quantum world, you can do a quantum Fourier transform and use that to factor a number. It's a very, very, very clever way of doing it. Since Peter Shaw developed that algorithm, there's been a whole slew of other algebraic algorithms. Nowadays, we have a whole toolkit of algorithms we can use in classical algebra, and a lot of those are going to find use in machine learning and artificial intelligence, because a lot of the things you need to do in machine learning and artificial intelligence rely on algebra. And then the final category is, Danica, something you mentioned with Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo is about basically using randomization to explore a large space of potentiality of possible things that might happen. And with a quantum computer, we can accelerate that. And with Monte Carlo, we can accelerate that what we call quadratically, which if you're looking at risk analysis or portfolio analysis in banking, can mean the difference between making a huge gain or a significant loss. There may be other areas we can use quantum computers. We haven't found them yet. But those three areas are essentially the things we've got. And part of what's happening now in the industry with quantum computing and with companies looking at how to exploit quantum computing is using those fundamental principles then to solve very specific problems. That's where the education comes in. That's where it's important to start using the technology. And that's where it's important to understand the economics and the economic impact.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mark, to your point about the economic impact, I think you made a fantastic point there. So one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is actually where quantum is not well suited. So because I'm in a business development role, I need to have a very good sense of where is the market being responsive. So I just got done with doing a data analysis project where I looked back at all the outreach that I've done over the past 8 or 9 months and broke it down by industry to see who is responding to this. And there are some very interesting findings there where on the surface level, there are algorithms that seem like they'd be very well suited for a certain industry, but I wouldn't get any response when I reached out to them. And I think that what's happening, to Mark's point about the economic impact, is that they may be so mature that even if we can give them an advantage for quantum, it may not have that much of an impact on their bottom line right now. So maybe in a few years, as we continue to develop this and things get better, then I can come back to them and we'll be in a different situation. But one thing that's been really interesting is to start analyzing and start realizing where this isn't quite the best fit. So I think one case we need to be pretty careful of is how mature is the industry, and then is their culture ready for this yet? I've had some very interesting conversations with people where they have told me, you know, here's the tools that we're working with, and we are just starting to think about AI. So to have you come in here and talk about quantum computing, that feels like a huge leap. So it's this really interesting change and this culture shift that we're going through of, even though we have potentially algorithms that could be a great fit for these industries, we have to be mindful of what are the economics like for them. Are
So
they
Dana, what are some of the industries that you don't think that quantum is suited for, just out of curiosity? Obviously finance is suited for it, health is suited for it. What isn't? Yeah, so there's a couple of very old industries, and I want to keep this a little bit close to my chest because I want to keep it a little bit close to my chest, but there's 2 very global industries in particular where you see them, they're all over the world, they're very important, we rely on them every day. And there's a lot of industry analysis, like analysts who are incredibly smart and who can look at the problems and look at the algorithms and find that sweet spot where you're saying this is the right fit. So the challenge is that sometimes that we'll have analysis saying this is a good fit, but then when you actually go out and talk to people in the marketplace, you start to realize it's not. Okay, come on. You leaked it out. You said you've got places that aren't. Now reveal. Are you talking about transportation? Are you talking about oils? Are you talking about give a broad, you don't have to give us details. What are the broad industries that are these large industries that aren't suited? Yeah, so manufacturing is one. And I think that one of the challenges that showed up there was I took it for granted that with manufacturing, there's different levels of it. And I worked in manufacturing for 2 years. So I have a lot of respect for this industry. There's a lot of value there. But there's different types of manufacturing. And one of the learnings that I took away from that was that these industries are all incredibly unique and that there's different levels of sophistication. So whether you're looking at advanced manufacturing or something that is maybe less advanced, where they're not using things like IoT or artificial intelligence, but they're still very successful, then those companies may not be the best fit for quantum computing. And that's one of those areas where you may not realize they're not the best fit until you do that outreach and you realize that they're not responding. And you have to start thinking about why. So manufacturing is one of the spots where I thought, you know what, optimization is going to be huge. And there are cases where it's a fantastic fit. Cambridge Quantum has done a lot of really great work with Nippon Steel. So it's an industry that I have so much respect for, and I have spent a good amount of time there. But it took some learnings to realize, okay, so as a whole, this isn't a blanket solution. We need to be more thoughtful about how we're approaching this.
Yeah, and I would agree with that because, you know, my time in Microsoft, you know, I would interact with customers that would run the spectrum from, you know, what Microsoft likes to call digital transformation, right? You know, that modern enterprise where everything's kind of everything that can be automated is automated. And really on the cutting edge of technology, or at least on the wave. But there's a lot of organizations that, you know, they still haven't experimented with the cloud, you know, because if they're successful with what they're doing today, then the C-suite has a hard time accepting the fact that, well, why should we experiment with this? Everything we have is working. And there are very large companies in the transportation sector that have that mentality. And one customer in particular I'm thinking of that I worked with, their company predates the information technology world, so they have what's known as NIH syndrome, not invented here syndrome. So they kind of have to build everything on their own. And I understand and I respect that they have their reasons for that, but they really need to kind of explore other options. They don't have to throw everything over to the new. But I mean, but Danica's right. If they're not embracing any kind of recent technology, then quantum is just another buzzword to them. Quantum is just another thing. I mean, I worked at a large German chemical company, and their first e-commerce project was basically it would be a website that would accept an order, and it would send an email, and then somebody would manually go into SAP and enter the the details of the order. There was this naive assumption that it went directly from the website into the back-end system. There was still a person in the loop. And that was very avant-garde. It was very high risk for them at the time. So, enterprises, I'd like to think, have kind of come a long way since then, but they may not have.
I'd like to give Danica a reframe to what you said, in the sense of who's engaging on quantum and who isn't. And my observations, I mean, this isn't 1-0. This isn't binary, but broadly speaking, if an enterprise, a customer, or industry uses or is close to the idea of supercomputing, so solving large, difficult computational problems in any way, and for material science, pharmaceuticals, this is certainly the case. For certain problems in optimization, this is also the case. And for certain very specific problems in finance, it's also the case. They use a lot of computational power. Then those companies are, broadly speaking, the ones who are actively engaged, exploring and understanding quantum computing today. The gap that you perceive with manufacturing is because there are very few problems in manufacturing where you need a supercomputer. Most of what's happening is being done by, as you said, IoT devices or standard compute center computing. And this has become acutely apparent to me since I started working for Quantum Brilliance, where we're working on room temperature diamond-based quantum computers. The idea being that these will be applicable in a smartphone in a few years or in an IoT device. And suddenly when you do that, when you make that assumption that you have some qubits which you can actually use, very, very low energy, very low footprint, small, compact, you can put them in an edge device. You can put, 100 of them into an absolutely standard compute center. Suddenly the whole economics changes. And then this technology becomes very, very relevant for the manufacturing industry. It becomes, because it's immediate and directly usable. You don't have to go to a quantum supercomputer. You can use a quantum accelerator. That changes the economics of the entire thing. But that's about to happen. We're on the cusp of that change. But certainly when I was working at IBM, Danica, that's exactly what I saw, is that the very, very specific problems in very specific industries where people were exploring quantum actively, and everybody else was kind of puzzled by it or playing quantum, we used to call it quantum tourists, people just interested in quantum computing. But I really think that's about to change.
We have one question from the audience, Bruce. Is that okay if we grab that? Robert, thanks for your question. What about the applied business use of Grover's algo? Are we there yet in applying to databases? Do we have enough qubits or oracles to get it together? What are you smiling about, Mark?
Very good question. So using Grover's algorithm, the Grover's algorithm is interesting because it provides only provides quadratic speedup. It's also interesting because specifically in the area of cryptography, you can use Grover's algorithm to reverse a hash. So it's part of a very effective attack vector on some cryptographic protocols. And as far as I'm aware, we're not there yet in terms of the number of qubits. The other thing about Grover's algorithm is it's in a sense, a classic quantum algorithm. Sounds like a contradiction, because it requires error-corrected qubits to work effectively. We don't have those yet. What's far more interesting is using what are called variational quantum algorithms, which work with the qubits we have today, which have errors, which are error-prone. So I mean, getting back to Robert's question, business use of Grover's algorithm, I think that's a few years away yet. We know where it can be used. We know, yeah, I mean, you cite the example of here, to applying it to databases. So for searching for particular values in a database, I'm not sure that that's the real world use case of Grover's algorithm. As I say, it's probably something that's going to be used elsewhere. The number of qubits isn't quite there yet.
Yeah, for a lot of these algorithms, the number of qubits, we're just tantalizingly close to do some interesting things. You know, I don't know, Mark, keep me honest, 60 to 80% of where we need to be to start doing interesting things. And I like Robert, I also thought Grover's algorithm was primarily a search type algorithm. I did not think of its use in reverse engineering hashes. I have some reading to do tonight.
All right, we are almost out of time. First of all, I want to thank you for evoking subjects that I haven't thought about in more decades than I care to admit. There's time for maybe one last thought from each of you, one takeaway that you'd offer to everybody. Mark, go ahead, one takeaway.
Oh, okay. So quantum computing is here to stay, but I think the real impact and acceleration and takeoff of the rocket towards quantum computing is just about to happen. So we've set the stage. The play is going to start now.
Danica?
Like I mentioned earlier, if you're someone who is interested in moving to the space, I'd really encourage you to network. And I have work with a fantastic group called the Quantum Strategy Institute, and we're all about helping people understand the space and thrive in it. So if you would like to reach out or get connected to that, you can find us on LinkedIn at Quantum Strategy Institute.
And Frank?
I would echo what Mark said. This is about to explode. We are in that kind of that Fairchild Semiconductor foundational era of this technology. I wasn't around for that revolution, but this one I am around, and I plan to fully participate in this one. And the best way to do that, like Danica said, is find a mentor, find someone who's digging this new path, and don't be afraid to forge your own path forward.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Lauren, over to you.
Thanks, everyone, for attending. We love having you. This webinar and all of our webinars are posted on our YouTube site within 24 hours. So you can catch it there again. Everyone who signed up for the lottery to win the books or the meeting rooms, the free meeting rooms, you'll be hearing from us in the next 24 hours also. And you can check us out on our social media network. And we look forward to our next winter webinar. Hope to see you all there. And thank you so much, panelists. You're wonderful. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for having me.